The moment the little girl tugged at his expensive coat sleeve, the world seemed to stop breathing. Her voice was barely louder than the hum of the marble-floored lobby, yet it cut deeper than any boardroom argument he had ever faced. She looked up at him with eyes far too old for her small face, eyes that carried fear, exhaustion, and a fragile hope that had nowhere else to go. Those eyes froze Jonathan Carter, a man who had closed billion-dollar deals without blinking, because in that instant, power meant nothing, and time felt dangerously thin. Before the story goes any further, take a moment right now. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that one small act can change a life forever, please like this video, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this exist to remind us of our shared humanity. Jonathan Carter was the kind of CEO people whispered about with a mix of admiration and fear. He ran one of the largest healthcare technology companies in the United States, headquartered in downtown Chicago, a city that never slowed down, and neither did he. His days were carefully scheduled, his emotions tightly managed, and his past neatly locked away. That morning had already been brutal, with a tense board meeting and looming layoffs that weighed heavily on his conscience, even if he never showed it. He was on his way out of the building, thinking about numbers and damage control, when the little girl appeared like a crack in the glass of his perfectly controlled life. Her name was Grace Miller, though Jonathan wouldn't learn that until much later. She was 7 years old, wearing a thin jacket that didn't quite fight off the Midwest cold, and clutching a backpack that looked heavier than it should have been. She had been sitting quietly in the lobby for hours, unnoticed by executives and assistants rushing past, waiting for someone who looked important enough to help. Her mother, Rachel Miller, had been working the night shift as a cleaning staff member in the same building, trying to keep food on the table after medical bills had swallowed their savings. That morning, Rachel collapsed in their small apartment, and no amount of shaking or pleading from her daughter could wake her. Jonathan didn't understand all of that yet. What he understood was the weight in his chest as the girl's fear seeped into him. Something about her reminded him of a life he rarely allowed himself to remember. Years ago, before the suits and skyscrapers, he had been a scared boy himself, standing beside a hospital bed where his own mother lay still after working herself sick. Back then, no CEO had stopped for him. Against every instinct shaped by years of corporate survival, Jonathan told his assistant to cancel his next meeting. The decision shocked even him. The girl let him out into the cold, to a run-down apartment building a few miles away, far from the polished world he ruled. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete and old paint, and each step felt like a descent into a reality he usually avoided. Inside the small apartment, time felt suspended. Rachel lay on a worn couch, her skin pale, her breathing shallow, the room filled with unpaid bills and silent prayers. Jonathan moved fast then, calling emergency services, staying grounded while chaos unfolded. Paramedics arrived, their urgency filling the cramped space. Grace stood frozen, her small hands clenched, watching strangers take her mother away. Jonathan stayed, even when it would have been easier to leave. He rode in the ambulance, sat in the hospital waiting room, and held Grace's backpack when her arms got tired. The hours that followed tested something deep inside him. Doctors spoke in careful tones about exhaustion, untreated illness, and how close Rachel had come to not making it. Grace fell asleep against Jonathan's side, trusting him without fully understanding why. For the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't thinking like a CEO. He was thinking like a son who remembered loss, like a man realizing how fragile success really was. Rachel survived, but recovery would take time. She wouldn't be able to work for months. The reality of that settled heavily over everything. Jonathan quietly arranged for her medical bills to be covered, but he knew money alone wouldn't fix what had been broken, so he did something that would later ripple through his entire company. He began looking closely at the people who kept his empire running from the shadows, the cleaners, the security guards, the night workers whose lives never showed up in profit reports. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan visited the Millers regularly. Grace started smiling again, her laughter slowly returning to the small apartment. Rachel, weak but alive, struggled with pride and gratitude, unsure how to accept help from a man whose life seemed so far removed from her own. Jonathan struggled too, confronting the parts of himself he had buried under ambition. He began to see leadership differently, not as control, but as responsibility. The change didn't stop there. Jonathan pushed for new employee support programs, healthcare access, and emergency assistance funds. Some executives resisted, citing costs and optics, but Jonathan stood firm. He told them that if a company couldn't protect the people who gave it their time and bodies, then it didn't deserve its success. The boardroom felt different now, heavier with purpose. Grace's life changed in quiet but profound ways. She returned to school with new confidence, knowing her mother was safe. Rachel healed slowly, eventually finding a less physically demanding role within the same company, treated not as a disposable worker, but as a valued human being. And Jonathan found something he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of peace that no bonus or headline had ever given him. As this story draws closer to its end, if it has touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes in compassion, and subscribe for more stories that remind us who we are at our best. Your support keeps these stories alive. Just before we close, we have a special request. Please comment below with one word that describes how this story made you feel. Your words matter more than you know. Years later, Jonathan would still think about that morning in the lobby, about how a whisper from a frightened child had changed the course of his life. Success hadn't lost its meaning, but it had gained a soul. Grace would grow up remembering not just the fear of that day, but the moment someone powerful chose to care. And in a world that often feels cold and rushed, that choice echoed quietly, proving that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power.